Today is the second part of our webinar on the resilience policy. We're going to have a short recap of what was in the previous one, but just for a couple of minutes. And Marcel, Kelvin, and myself will present. Marcel, over to you, and I think we can start. Also about the questions and answers, I suggest in order for us to go through with the presentation, if you have a questions, you write them down, and preferably in a chat as well, if you can, so we can see them. And then after we finish, we're going to have questions and answer session.
Do you want me to share the screen?
Yes, I think that would be a good.
Okay. Or maybe Kelvin, can you share the PowerPoint? Would that be possible?
Yes, sure. Just a minute, please.
Okay. Hello, everyone. In the meantime, can give you a short overview of the presentation. As Anna said, there will be first a short review of the last presentation. And then I will follow up with values and principles that we outlined in the policy, then resilience factors and crisis response. This will be done by Anna, and monitoring and evaluation will be outlined by Kelvin. So, I cannot see the presentation. Yeah, here we go. Here we go. Good. Can you go to the next? What we presented last time was first the framework for resilience forming. Here you see the wheel, that is the guiding framework. Around is the frame, which is comprising of governance, participation, representation, and leadership. Then this includes the 8 main thematic areas which cover the basic aspects of life. And in the center is risk knowledge, which is a very important element. If you don't know the risks, we cannot really act on it. Next slide. Maybe a little bit more practical is the resilience pathway model. Here you see the pathway model in 2 parts. The first one is the development part of resilience building. Here you see mainly data collection and data analysis before you can really take care of risks, or risk governance takes place. And then implementation is mainly divided in 3 possible parts. This is a proactive, a retrospective, or a reactive resilience way of working. And the second part is the recovery, or the humanitarian part, which should be a smaller part. Again, it starts with data analysis, and then with risk management and so on. What is very important outlined here, it should be more a proactive way that resilience is built into the development work rather than in disaster management. All right, the next one, yes. On values, I have outlined first a little bit the values we have as ADRA network. You are familiar with these three basic values: connected, courageous, and compassionate. These three values, when it comes to resilience, the practical part for connectedness is a structured, good dialogue and sharing of information, maintain or enhance mutual learning, create partnerships, and building of relationships. The list is not, of course, much longer, but these are some core practices to connectedness. Courageous, there it's more about create independence, facilitate the process, transparent and honesty, and the role model pathway. So we are going ahead. We show how these things are working. And on compassionate, it's more an empathetic role, visionary and energized, encouraging and empowering, and going the extra mile. Yes, more important is the next slide. Here, some values on enhancing resilience. There are also three major values. The first one is buffer capacity. On the buffering capacity, it's very simple. If the bank account is empty, we have not much money to go and buy food. So human capital, financial capital, social capital, physical capital, natural capital, these are all important capitals or resources that are needed to buffer capacity. And on self-organization, it's mainly cooperation and network, building trust, reliance on resources, on own resources, and ownership building on about what you have. And the third one is the learning capacity. This is probably the most important one that we are able to learn. I will get to that a little bit later in principles also. On the learning capacity, it's knowledge of threat and opportunities, as you saw in the framework, shared vision, commitment to learning, knowledge identification, capability and monitoring, knowledge sharing capability, knowledge transfer capability, functioning feedback mechanism, and also structured dialogue. Next one. So now we come to the 7 principles, which are outlined also in the policy. I will read you first in black the principle, and then outline these principles a little bit in more practical details. So the principle 1 is maintain diversity and redundancy. In a social ecological system, components such as species, landscape types, knowledge systems, actors, cultural groups, faith groups, or institutions all provide different options for responding to change and dealing with uncertainty and surprise. Redundancy provides insurance within a system by allowing some components to compensate for the loss or failure of others. The practical things on this is diversity, of course. Natural meadows attract insects. If you have no natural meadows, if it's all monoculture, it's not please remain on principle 1. Yes. It's important that meadows are natural, insects are attracted, insects pollinate flowers, and fruits and vegetables are growing. You know, these are the natural ways of diversity. And redundancy is about job rotation, for instance, at the community leadership increases a sense of responsibility and ownership. So if always the same person is leading out in a community, the others may just get passive. This is important that some sharing of responsibility takes place. Monoculture or megacities, these are negative examples of diversity. They create vulnerability rather than resilience. Next one, principle 2. Manage connectivity. Connectivity can both enhance and reduce the resilience of social ecological systems and the ecosystem services they produce. Well-connected systems can overcome and recover from disturbance more quickly, but overly connected systems may lead to the rapid spread of disturbance across the entire system so that all components of the system are impacted. Practice: a community where all members are included and achieve their goals in a participative way is stronger than and more resilient than an individualized group. Maybe also here in Europe, where everyone works just on his own and doesn't share resources. So the main values here are participation, sharing, dialogue. This is what is needed to build connectivity. Principle 3. Can you switch to principle 3? Number 3 is manage slow variables and feedback. Social ecological systems can often be configured in different ways. There are many ways in which all the variables in a system can be connected and interact with one another. And these different configurations provide different ecosystem services. The practice: I've taken a watershed system. It includes erosion or sedimentation, which influences the slope and speed of the running water, which is also influenced by the weather and seasons. This all influences the ecosystem and the danger of flooding, which impacts agriculture and livelihood. So here it's important to be sensitive, to be attentive to slow variables like erosion, like building up of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. All these different things, they come slowly, but we need to be aware of it and somehow, or in the best way, work against it in a proactive way. Next slide. Number 4 is foster complex adaptive system thinking. In order for us to continue benefit from a range of ecosystem services, we need to understand the complex interactions and dynamics that exist between actors and ecosystem in a social ecological system. Here the practice: see the context. When buying cheap clothing in a supermarket, you probably support the work slaves in Far East or in other factories where the clothes are manufactured very cheap and people don't earn their living. Or you even support child labor maybe, who cannot afford a balanced meal or going to school or whatever. Make a connection of the work honeybees are doing when pollinating blossoms. This is also a huge system. Think all processes till the end. This is also part of system thinking. If we do not understand what kind of components are interacting with each other and how they may disturb a certain system, we make wrong decisions. So we need to understand the complexity of today's system and how they work together before we can take measures or proactive decisions. Principle 5, encourage learning. As already mentioned in one of the core values, knowledge of a system is always partial and incomplete, and social ecological systems are not exceptions. Efforts to enhance the resilience of social ecological systems must therefore be supported by continuous learning and experimentation. There are different levels of learning. You may learn something new, or you learn something from a mistake, or you learn from experience. All these different learnings are part of our lifelong learning, and it's very important that we engage in learning, but learning only takes place where we make experience, where we analyze, where we reflect whatever we do, or we reflect the activities in a project to understand what influence such an activity has, what impact comes out of it. Resilience principle 6. Broaden participation. Participation through active engagement of all relevant stakeholders is considered fundamental to building social ecological resilience. It helps build the trust and relationships needed to improve legitimacy of knowledge and authority during decision-making processes. Participation, here an example from our daily work. Instead of ADRA being the main player and implements activities by themselves, it includes as much as possible local stakeholders who take ownership of a certain activity or a certain part of a project and show how they adopt this new technology or method or whatever. And it's better to have participation and understand how the local communities are dealing with something rather than we just implement something. This enriches the learning experience, it increases the success rate, and it creates effective use of resources, of course. Principle 7. This is probably the most difficult one. Promote polycentric governance. Polycentricity is a governance system in which multiple governing bodies interact to make and enforce rules within a specific policy arena or location. This is one of the best ways to achieve collective action in the face of disturbance and change, according to the Stockholm Resilience Center. Here, some very practical things are a data bank that gives access to the police, decision makers, and other stakeholders in European countries to stop trafficking, for instance. If only the police has access to the data bank, a lot of information is missing. Data collection on carbon footprint for certain products. It's another way of polycentric governance. Or the line ministries, media, police, not policy, police, NGOs and CBOs are working together to minimize corruption. So there are a lot of polycentric governance needed today to effectively solve problems in our societies. So, and now I'm handing over to Anna for the next part.
Thank you, Marcel. So in my part, we're going to quickly look at different types of pressures that communities or individuals are experience that impact their resilience. And then we're going to look at the practical suggestions that the policy suggests in our humanitarian, our emergency aid, and as well as in development. I mean, they're not going to be exclusive. So, I mean, of course, there is always more than this, but it's a major some major parts of this we will cover. So before we start, I wanted to introduce you one concept that is not necessary in
to see Anna disappearing. Calvin, can you bring? Yes, okay.
Hello, Marcel.
Yes, Calvin. Is Anna coming back or?
Is it visible?
Yeah, the presentation is visible, but I did not prepare that part of the presentation. Let me call Anna quick. All right. So how shall we do that?
Marcel, I think we could just talk
Book
through
could,
this.
yeah, Prabhu, kindly just help us.
Yes, and I would also invite Virginia. I saw Virginia's mic on unmuting as well, because this is our team that worked on it. Until Anna comes, I guess we are now discussing at this moment about the resilience factors. And in our policy, we have divided them into two main categories. One is exogenous and the other one is endogenous. So basically the exogenous is the external pressures faced by the community. And okay, I think I can see Anna coming in. So let's pass it on to Anna. And I think the presentation will be clearer that way.
Sorry for this. I'm back. I don't know what's happened. I just got kicked out. So can I continue?
Yes, Anna.
Yeah, sorry for this. I hope there will be no interruptions. Yeah, so I was presenting this little concept of the donut economy. You see inside there is a circle of the social foundation, and there is a different types of needs that we as a humans have, water, energy, food, and so on. And they have to be met for us as ADRA to fulfill our role to provide, basically to fulfill the basic needs of the people. And so we work within these two circles. First, the outer one is that we have only enough resources on a planet and we have to use them wisely because other resources we don't have. And the other side, we have the needs of the population that we have to meet. And so looking at this pressure, we will, there are, first of all, the external pressures. So basically the pressures that outside that are determined by the borders of our planet. Currently, we experience pressure of the climate change and it impacts our population, our communities, our food production, settlements, our extreme events. So we as ADRA see a lot of impact with the rise of the disaster that more than doubled in the last 200 years. Also, if we look at the concentration of carbon dioxide or CO2 in the atmosphere, our planetary border, or how much our planet can carry, is 350 particles per million, and we are now at 400 and we're rising. So it means we overstepped the planetary border, and if we are going to go this way, we are going to have the climate crisis, which we already know that we have now. Another pressure that is external or exogenous is the quality of air, soil, and basically pollution. You know that it reduces quality of air and is a cause of the many health problems. A good example of this is a big mega cities, like for example, New Delhi, where the especially some most vulnerable areas, which are slums and the areas of production where the fabrics are located, are most polluted ones. Yeah. And also another one is the biodiversity loss. Biodiversity is reducing as monocultures are increasing, and as we convert land more and more, and as a following of it, our harvests are reducing. It also impacts health of the population. We can look at the area that is now currently covered with the forest, and it is 62% and it's going down, whereas the planetary border, or how much we need for our planet to function in a balance, is 75. So we are below this border where we can carry. So situation does not look good, but there is a solution. There is a good news what we could do about it, and is that we could transit to the green economy. And later we will look at the different aspects of it. But basically, green economy or clean economy is that economy that takes into consideration the environment, that recycles, and yeah, basically in a livelihoods there are different concepts of it, like for example nature-based solution, regenerative agriculture that Brendan will want to probably elaborate on later, and so on. That basically it's working together with the environment and not produce something that cannot be later recycled. Also zero waste concept is there. So there are a lot of these approaches we already tested in ADRA, but as we see, we need to probably put more emphasis on this in the future. Okay, the next slide. Next slide. That is the next slide. Yeah, now we're going to look at the internal pressures. So as a consequence of the external pressures, we also have things that are restricting our resilience on the internal level. One of them is, for example, vulnerable infrastructures. And as a continuing trend, we have the underinvestment in the capital works, and especially in the areas which are most vulnerable. So again, the slums, the areas where the low-income population is living. Global urban population is living in slums is currently 24%, which is a quite high percentage for our society. Another internal or endogenous pressure is the social demographic change and related to this inequality. So basically here we see how the social justice and environment come together. The less people earn in the lower quality housing areas they live in. And as a consequence, they are more affected by the environmental pressures, for example, bad housing, housing on the river banks, like for example, I saw in Vietnam where the flood affect the people every year, or housing in a very air polluted areas or the water quality, or low water quality areas, but which later impact people's health and their resilience, because for example, every year they know that the flood is coming, but they don't have anywhere to go. Another aspect of it is social and human capital. We can see when the human or community lacks of education, opportunity, training, human health and income, the engagement into the civil society, the engagement into the society, into the change of the society is reducing, because they're looking forward to meet their basic needs. Currently, the amount of population who are illiterate on our planet is 15%, which is quite high. This is a pressures. Now we're going to look at the suggested solution in our projects. The next slide, please. Yeah, we will start with the acute crisis response, or as a response of ADRA into, we will look into our humanitarian projects. So the first suggestion from us is to meet basic needs. You see here on the right, this is the pyramid of Maslow of the basic needs that we probably all know from school. And on the bottom, there are physiological needs like food, water, and so on. And before we're able to meet those basic needs, we will not be able to talk about resilience. We will not be able to build more sustainable infrastructures and human infrastructures in the community. So our first suggestion to start with a basic need, so the community can later switch to the or step up to the second phase with the security needs and so on, and so we can work more on the long-term resilience. The next one. No, yes, thank you. Another suggestion is psychosocial support. The survivors of the disasters, they are often not able to work on the more resilience approaches, not able to work on the recovery of the infrastructure without receiving some mental health support. So we as ADRA see the need and great value in promoting great mental health initiatives, as well as counseling and referrals. Another aspect of acute crisis response or humanitarian response is education in emergencies. We see a great value in continuing the education of the children, and as following the providing them with a safe space, as well as psychological safety and the routine, which will contribute to the resilient future and which will allow the most vulnerable areas or most vulnerable countries to have access to the education, which in turn will improve the resilience of the country. So education emergency is a great important aspect here. Okay, the next one. Yeah, another aspect of the support is cash of the resilience. As you know, a lot of donors now are switching to cash as well, and the question is often not why cash, but why not cash in the humanitarian response. Of course, we recognize that should be a good analysis of where cash is working logistically and otherwise, but often it is able to provide quicker response. So we especially suggest the use of multi-purpose cash transfers, as they provide intended multi-sectoral response. Also, you give the empowerment to the community and to the people to more or less choose themselves how to address their basic needs. Another aspect of it is networks and collaborations. We would like to, as a network, collaborate with the different other offices, but also collaborate outside of the network with clusters in a humanitarian response, with the communities. That is important. Another aspect of it is the communication technologies that allow for collaboration. For example, social media, geotechnology, crowdsourcing, and some others. So important aspect of resilience in the humanitarian response is looking for collaboration of working together on a different levels through the technical resources and the platforms, as well as through participation in all the clusters and through the work with the different types of stakeholders. The next one. Another one is inclusion, and we all know that inclusion is important because there is a different types of people in the community. This example specifically related to the people with disabilities, but we are looking at all different kinds of inclusion, disabled people, women, girls, poorest, elderly, LGBT people, and yeah, again, person with disabilities. So on the steps, how do you make the inclusion possible in the humanitarian response? One of the steps is to identify these people, identify and know your community and see how many disabled people, if you take example of the people with disabilities, are there. Also track them before disaster, during disaster, and after disaster. Another step is the consultation, so basically exchange on the needs of the people so that they are also involved in decision making. The third step is a specific support, because on the example of disability is diverse and the needs are, of course, very much diverse. So the support needs to be tailored to all the needs of the disabled people, and it is based on the step 2 consultation. Another part of it is to train our own people or other staff how to work with people with disabilities. Some research prove that people who are not trained to work with people with disability or often don't know how to address disability, or they leave out people sometimes unintentionally. So we need to look that we provide training, provide education there, so our staff know how to approach that. And the last step is engagement with organization of disabled people, for example, a disabled people organization and some others, to actively work together on the projects. Thank you. The next one. Another suggestion is environmental protection, and we talk a lot about, do we need to have environmental aspects in our humanitarian action, and our suggestion is yes, we need to have it. And how to do this is the first step by having the climate and environmental risk analysis. So first of all, as Marcel said in the beginning, in the pathway models, we need to know the risks. We need to know the risks and address them, and when the residual risk is happening, we will address them in emergency. So here we need to know what are the environmental and climate change risks before the starting the response. There are different tools for this. One of them is a rapid environmental assessment, as well as some others. Maybe we can have an exchange on this later. Another suggestion related to the humanitarian response is to practice adequate waste management system during the emergencies. This is also specifically related to the waste management in the camps, refugee camps, which has to be set up. So we have to look at after the environment of the camp. Reducing emissions and pollution during the transportation. So we need to look at our own transportation provided by the project, how is it addressed by the, how does it impact the environment. So perhaps there could be some reevaluation, what is needed, how different types of transport can be used, and so on and so forth. Analysis and a smart positioning of stocks in the areas of high disasters. We all know if the prepositioning stocks are closer to the area, it reduces environmental impact. So it means that you don't need to transport with huge trucks things from the one end of the country to the other. So it's a good solution there. And another aspect is the analysis of the vendors, analysis of the people from whom you're buying the goods from. Maybe take a look at a little bit on the history of the vendor. Are they comply with the environmental standards? maybe identify just a few environmental standards that are important to you and put them into your procurement policy or your tender documents, let's say. And this, of course, all should be done prior to the disaster where as possible, and to some extent in your humanitarian response as well. The next one. Now we're going to look at the development, at our chronic crisis response. One of the important aspects here is the livelihoods, employment, and the business development. We suggest to support the productive inclusion programs through the small grants, through the investment into the businesses, through making basically people self-employed and self-sufficient through their livelihoods. Another aspects of the livelihoods could be cash for work, for example, for reforestation or for building some infrastructures. To provide for people opportunities for income and at the same time to address the risks and minimize them. The next slide. Again, another important aspect in the development work as well is the risk analysis. In comparison to the humanitarian response, in the development, we usually have more time to understand and to analyze the risk, and we suggest to take a full advantage of this, to basically look at the good risk assessment, that your risk assessment, they incorporate also environmental and climate change aspects. There are also separate assessment on the environmental and climate change, for example, environmental impact assessment and some others. And suggestion here is to either include in your need assessment environmental aspect of the assessment, or conduct completely separate assessment on the environmental risk, so you are aware of them before you actually start implementing. The whole I would say the whole heart of our policy is to not manage in disaster, but manage the risks, because disasters are not manageable. The problem only, or the hazards are not manageable. We can only manage the risk and reduce it. And here in our development work, we have the best opportunity to identify and manage the risk. Residual risk that is left after addressing this risk will be taken care of on the humanitarian response. Another aspect is the sustainable agriculture, we are looking to work on the sustainable agriculture that is environmentally friendly and supports biodiversity, as opposed to, for example, promoting monocultures or chemical fertilizers. There are some discussion if we should call it climate smart agriculture or sustainable agriculture, because sometimes climate smart agriculture could be seen as agriculture that is just adapting to climate change but not supporting biodiversity. But we would like to emphasize his importance of biodiversity. And there are different types of this kind of agriculture or methods, let's say, put it this way, for example, organic agriculture, permaculture, regenerative agriculture, nature-based solutions. All of them are quite a good aspect and is supported here. Another slide. Again, we would like to work in our project to reduce the emissions and to have as low as possible emissions in our projects in a development stage, as well as the humanitarian response. Promote low emission and climate resilience development, greenhouse gas emissions through our logistics, through our procurement, to our office setup and energy use. One example of this could be, for example, if we're using a generator, we could make a little analysis and see, do we really need 100% of the power of this generator, or maybe 30% will be sufficient, and reduce it. Another direct activity is a soil improvement, or basically storing carbon in the soil and binding them in there. Improvement of production chain and packaging. Packaging is another question. What is the materials we use for the packaging? What is the promoted there? We try to promote nature-based solution and natural packaging as much as possible, or the packaging that could be biodegradable. Another aspect is working on the consumption behavior in our projects. And Another point there is the support to capacity of the local CSOs. Our local CSO is the actors on the ground who actually are driving the change forward. So we have to enable them to work effectively and to make sure that their voice is heard on the government level. So hence we suggest their support assessment capacity of the CSOs and building the programs that meet their needs based on the assessment capacity. And these programs can be in general organizational building, like support to the SOP, and as well as in the thematic areas, for example, in environmental, in gender, in protection. And also important aspect is their exchange or peer exchange between NGOs and the government, so maybe some umbrella organizations as well. Okay, thank you. The next one. And the last aspect is the waste management in the development. Yeah, so we need to manage the waste because when you talk about the waste with the communities, it's often said, well, we use, for example, bury and burn practice, and it's a traditional practice in the community. But if you think about just about 200 years ago, there were no non-degradable materials lying around, like plastics and some others, batteries and equipment, white good waste. So what we're producing now is not corresponding with the old waste management types, like just burn and bury and so on. So we have to find a new ways to address these new types of waste that we developed in the last 100 years. We have to have the assessment of the waste management or the waste management situation in our projects. We have to have awareness in the community, and awareness is probably the most important part here. How this can be binded is through the policy development. And policy development can be done on the community level through the action plan for the waste management reduction, built into the, for example, village development plans, or into this kind of village plans for the action, or also into the national plans or the regional policy for the waste management. I put here two pictures which I like from the NGO from Australia, which is called 1 Million Women, and they work mostly on the environmental issues, but I really like, and I think these aspects we need to consider more in our projects. For example, how do we get to the zero waste? Refuse, reduce, reuse, recycle, and rot. This is a concept that we're trying to pilot in our circular economy projects, and I think more of this should be piloted on the ADRA network level. Another one with the dog and dolphins is basically showing that there are different types of actions we could do as a ADRA or as a community. There is, of course, a huge corporate responsibility for the pollution or for the waste, and we as ADRA could provide lobby on some national or maybe regional level. There is a policy change. Again, as I said, we need to look at the policy on the community level and perhaps on the national, regional level, where we could change the behavior of the communities themselves. And another one is individual action. And here our awareness is important, where we promote that to people that even a single action of a single person is important, and on the long term going to have an impact on the environment and on the resilience of community in turn. Good, that's it from my side. And now Kelvin.
Thank you very much, Anna. And now that we've looked through our proposed solutions towards creating resilient actions to our development and humanitarian actions, both at acute and chronic crisis, we are now going to look through the last part of the policy, and that's the M&D. That's the M&D. So in order to assess resilience outcome in ADRA response, sorry, just a minute. In order to assess resilience outcomes in ADRA response and programs, we need to train our eyes in ways that we can detect changes at two different levels. And that's at the chronic situation where sustained stresses as well as change uncertainties are affecting people and systems. And also at the crisis scenario where a shock has occurred. So timely information about the context, and this includes measures of risk that provide a means to better understanding the complex factors that influence resilience to shocks and stresses in a given context. And as such, as earlier mentioned by Anna, it is therefore vital that we measure the risks, and more so the risk of losses, from a range of hazards, vulnerability, and stresses. And this is so that we're able to understand whether our interventions have been successful in building resilience. So monitoring, evaluation, and learning, that's MIL, as we all have come or rather engaged with in our country offices, enable us then to better understand and capture then the positive changes towards ensuring our interventions effectiveness and impact. So using the resilience, the MIL rather, in our resilience programming is not about creating new tools or methodologies that are different from the existing MIL structures in our organizations, but rather it's all about then how the existing MIL results framework can help us develop, evidence and learning to enhance our work on resilience. So here we have an image of a typical MIL framework, and as I've mentioned, some of the issues to capture looking through this particular image, we all can, we can all agree to most of the steps as the first image. Sorry, we can all agree or testify to some of the steps in our normal MIL frameworks. That is at the input level, we have the input measurable indicators. We have the activity outputs, where we have our activity outputs measurable indicators. And then at the interim outcomes is where now we look at our resilience aspect, where now we're going to look at the resilience capacity indicators. And at the outcome level, we're going to look at the effective resilience response indicators. And at the impact, we are going to look at the well-being indicators. And not to forget to mention the shock stresses, that's the shock and stresses indicators. And also looking through at the frequency of data collection. And this is kind of not so much different from our normal MIL results framework. And for our resilience programming, we ought to look at baselines, and this is at the before the project and also at the end line, so as to address the resilience capacity indicators. And at the effectiveness resilience response indicators, the data collection frequency then will have to be high, and this is also for the case of measuring the impact and as well as the shock and stresses. And all these I'm going to explain further in the coming slides. So ADRA resilience focus framework then will be based on the ADRA MIL framework that exists at our country offices. And this will then come with the following additional components, which are listed here forth. And the first one will be components that are going to address then the set of resilience capacities that the project will aim to strengthen, including prevention and mitigation actions. The second set of the additional component that is going to be, or rather to form part of our normal MIL framework, will be then the type of risks, shocks, and or stresses in the project area, as well as then the indicators and methods for tracking their occurrence and severity. The third aspect will be then a set of responses that is expected to result from the effective utilization of the resilience capacity, in the face of then the shocks and stresses. And also we're going to look at the well-being outcomes. And in this particular component then, resilience capacities and response indicative questions that will allow the understanding of how resilience is built and how the approach allows individuals, households, and communities, as well as systems to bounce back after a shock or stress are going to be addressed. So last but not the least, then we will have to look at the type of measurement where apart from the normal qualitative and quantitative, we're also going to look at the objective and subjective measures that are going to monitor rather and evaluate these indicative questions. So next, we're going to look at the analytical model of what we've just discussed, these particular components. And these components are going to be divided into three distinct components. That is the ex ante component, the disturbance, and the export component. But more importantly then, as we look at these indicators that are required to model our resilience is the scale. So we have to define our scales, or rather look through the scale of operation for a project. It could be either at the household level, is it at the community, regional, or national. And from there, then we're going to look at the first component, the ex ante component, which is the initial states and capacities. And this then is data that describes the initial state before a shock. And some of the categories of indicators then that EU M&D ought to look at is then the resilience capacities, the initial well-being of the community or the household. We also look at then the initial vulnerability of the community. From these indicators, then the second component is the disturbance component. Here, then we look at the risks, shocks, and stresses, and this data. This data that describes the risk, shocks, and stresses, have a category of indicators that we can look at, and this includes the natural disasters, the disease and pest outbreaks. We have the political conflicts as well as the economic shocks. Last but not the least is the export component, and this then entails data on the subsequent states or trajectories after the shocks. And the categories of indicators then that we ought to look at here is then the resilience capacity. How then has it changed from the initial state? How then is the well-being? How has it again changed from the initial well-being? And last but not the least is the vulnerability. So here is where then most of us will look at then we look at the baseline service, the end line rather to end line service, so that we compare them with the initial baseline service. And as I'd mentioned, the methods we look at then the qualitative, we can have the quantitative, objective, and subjective methods. So all this, not to forget, is that then they'll be looked through the local component and contextual factors, such as the environmental condition, as well as the political condition of the area. Moving to the next slide will be then the application example of the analytical model, which has been put into perspective from the additional component that we ought then to add to MIL framework on resilience programming. So we have here an example of proposed measures for estimating food security resilience. And as I had mentioned, first, we have the baseline, where then we are going to look at the well-being and the basic condition measures. And here then we look at example of indicators then, such as the food security at the current moment before the intervention. We could also look at the health and the nutrition index. We could also look at the asset index, the social capital index, so much more. This is also to include the psychosocial measures as well as the poverty measures. So these are the indicators that then we ought to look at the first instance of our baseline studies. Second is at the disturbance measures. If you remember, taking you back, to the second component, that is the disturbance component. So here then we're going to look at measures that entail shocks, stress, as well as risks. And important to notice then we ought, or rather we have to capture then the frequency, the duration, and the intensity. And here we're going to look at the covariant shocks and stresses that happen to affect most community at the household level. So here we look at the drought, we look at indicators such as the floods, we look at the health shocks, market among other issues, or other indicators such as trade and policy. Next is also the idiosyncratic shocks or stresses, and these are stresses that happen to affect individuals at a community level. And here we look at indicators such as illness and death, and this could be as a result of disasters. We also look at loss of income. A good example is during this particular era of COVID. We also look at the crop failures at that particular community level. How then has it been? We look at those indicators, as well as also indicators such as livestock losses, which could be either resulting from the drought or the floods. Last but not the least, at this disturbance measure is also the risk. So which risks then exist at the community level that affect the resilience of this particular community or household? And we could also look at or rather gather indicators around conflict, disasters, as well as negative impacts of climate change. So from the disturbance measures, we then look at the response measures. And here then is the heart of resilience, where then we look at indicators that then help these particular communities to cope, or rather to bounce back to their normal state. And here we look at three key capacities, and the first being the absorptive capacity. I think these particular capacities were well covered during our first part of the webinar. And then here we are going to look at the coping behavior, indicators on coping behavior, indicators with relation to risk management, indicators relating to informal safety nets that exist in the community. We also look at the conflict mitigation indicators as part of the absorptive capacity, as well as savings and loaning associations in the community and how they've managed to respond to the disturbance. Second, then we look at the adaptive capacity, and here then we look at the existing human capital. We look at changes that have occurred in issues relating to debt and credit. We also look at the psychosocial as well as livelihood diversification that the community might have adopted resulting from the disturbance, and that is before the intervention came into action. So the other third indicator that we ought to look in our projects during our monitoring and evaluation is the transformative capacities. And this is the long term, where then we look at the governance mechanism in the area of implementation. We also ought to look at community networks that have evolved over time during our interventions, and also our use of the basic services, how it has changed over time, and not to forget to mention other indicators such as uses of infrastructure, as well as policy and regulation that could have been brought about by the intervention, either adopted or proposed and developed by the existing community systems as well as the government. So last but not the least, then at the end line, we then ought to measure the well-being and the basic conditions which the project or the program has been taking part in. And then here then rather we look at indicators, changes that have occurred. So we compare these particular indicators with those during the start of the project, the baseline data. And here we look at indicators that have changed, comparing, for instance, food security vis-a-vis the food security rather conditions at the end of the project compared to the food security conditions before the project began. We're also going to compare the health and nutrition index, the social capital index, the access to services index. We're also going to look at this the psychosocial measures, as well as the poverty measures that might have changed or occurred during the process of the intervention. So those are some of the issues, or rather an example of issues that we ought to look at our project during our resilience project implementation. Last but not the least is that the annex, this is the last part of the policy document, and here it outlines two documents or attachment rather. One is it's the good practices documentation template, where we all know then that a good practice is a practice that has been proven to work well and produce good results, and is therefore recommended as a model. And it is a successful experience which has been tested and validated in the broad sense, which has been repeated and deserves to be shared so that a great number of people can adopt it. So here we give a template for our country offices to adopt while documenting these good practices, because as we all are aware, then a meal also entails the learning component. And so if one resilience project has been done well, for instance in Madagascar, and it has proved to actually work best, or rather changed the well-being of the community, it's best then that they document it in a way that other country offices can adopt the same. So here we have the template that the policy has provided, so that we are all in the same line. The other document is on the DRR and resilience indicators, and we've mentioned the term indicator a lot. And what an indicator is that it provides critical information on performance, achievements, and accountability, which is the cornerstone of effective monitoring and evaluation. And simply, indicators are standardized measures that then allow for comparison over time. So important to note is that then these resilience indicators that have developed, or rather have been provided by the policy, meet the requirement that they describe the change in the livelihoods of those involved in the intervention, and not just as a result. Rather, they don't just give the end results. So it's more of the indicators, describing the impact rather than the output. So the policy document provides a list of indicators that can be put into use, and also not to forget to mention that it's not, we've not rather captured all indicators, because we ought, or rather we look forward then to continue pre-filling this particular attachment based on some of the information that we are going to get from the good practices from the country offices. So just to conclude, is that the final test of ADRA's resilience success will be whether or not our development action has succeeded in securing intended improvements in the well-being of communities, and in reducing losses and damages from climate-related stresses, despite the intensified risks that have been posed by the manifestation of climate change. Thank you very much. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Kelvin. Well, right now over to you, everybody, because perhaps you have questions. Let's talk. Now is the time. Ask us the questions, and we will try to respond.
Maybe the question from John, is that answered, or do you want to have some more details or explanation?
I suppose John is not here anymore, but I hope the questions was answered. Yeah, guys, do you have any questions? Everything was very clear, or maybe not clear at all, but ask us. Let's have conversation. What are your thoughts about it? Maybe we missed something.
Good morning. Oh, good. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Susan.
Yes, good morning. Thank you so much for the very informative presentations. My network was a bit poor, so I missed some of the part of the presentation. So forgive me if I ask something that could have been presented. But I just wanted to ask on the issues to do with mapping resilience pathways for communities. I don't know if you can shed more light on that.
Prabhu is with us, but a resilience pathway was mostly covered in our first part of the presentation. I don't know if Prabhu want to briefly summarize in one word, but generally, if you would like to take a deeper look, I suggest you look at the recording of the first session, and we will provide a link. We will resend the link. But Prabhu, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure, Anna. Thank you, and thanks a lot for that question. And maybe if Kelvin could go to that second slide, which shows the pathways model, you will notice, and once again, this was highlighted quite a bit during our last session, that a large portion of the pathways model has data collection or data analysis. If you follow the steps that are described in the policy, data collection, the baseline data to analyze the shocks and stresses, vulnerabilities, and then of course identifying the key stakeholders under the risk management component, which comes under the development stream, you automatically start identifying the key stakeholders and then also the pathways that are available. Now, the pathways model itself shows the link between the development and the humanitarian stream. However, the pathways that you're asking about is actually the pathways that the communities would have to access. And if this model is followed, you would have that information with you. I think Anna has shared a link to that webinar. Thanks, Anna. So you can look at that. Also, there is another series of 5 webinars separately by Stefan Kohler, which I will put the link here, and you are welcome to look at that also, which has it a little bit more in detail.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarification. I missed this part. Thank you.
And I'm gonna send you now the link for the webinars with Stefan Kohler from UN Ops, also partially on the resilience pathways. I just shared with you in the chat. Brendan, I saw you wanting to ask something. You still want to ask something?
Yeah, not so much ask, but just perhaps offer a little bit of a comment. Really well done to the team who've worked on this. This is really excellent stuff. Thank you for being willing to make available these presentations and also the background document that has come out of this. The more we can share and spread this among our country offices and the better it will be, because then it can start to have greater awareness at a much wider level. Really heartened to see that some aspects of what you're talking about in terms of the discussion around the sustainable agriculture and the linkage that has to climate and also to resilience. Really, really important. Really good studies coming out in terms of climate change is that regenerative agricultural approaches potentially offer the greatest capacity to start to draw down the excess CO2 that we have in the atmosphere. As you highlighted, Anna, historically we were at 280 parts per million
CO2 prior to the Industrial Revolution, and now I think the latest data is around about 415 parts per million. So that we're having a massive impact. So there's an excess of CO2 in the atmosphere of around about 880 gigatons of CO2. And there's also an excess that's dissolved in the seawater in the oceans, which is already changed pH quite significantly and is acidifying the oceans. So in terms of like resilience, one of the best approaches is actually at a local level and more widely is to engage in regenerative agricultural approaches that draw down massively CO2 deposited in the soil safely, but at the same time it's building soil fertility, it's building drought resistance, it's building soil water holding capacity so droughts become much more manageable, etc. So there's a whole bunch of, shall we say, collective or additive impacts that transitioning to a really regenerative approach can have impacts at multiple levels, not just in terms of food security, but much wider beyond that. I just wanted to share that thought.
Thank you. I also shared your video that you recently sent on the carbon soil storage, if you don't mind, in the chat. So maybe that will be interesting for somebody to look at the short one.
There's a great documentary that's been released on Netflix called Kiss the Ground, of which that short 4-minute video was a subset of that. It's about a 1-hour documentary. If you search for Kiss the Ground, that gives a much more detailed discussion around that. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of really interesting things out there that are emerging over the last 20 years. And as ADRA, I think we have the chance, when we look at what ADRA has actually been doing in many countries, we've actually been doing these things, but we've never been labeling them as strongly engaging in climate mitigation actions and adaptation actions. But in fact, in reality, they are. I think you look back across many years, a lot of the actions that ADRA has been taking actually are in that space. We just have been talking about them in terms of livelihood or in terms of food security or in terms of income generation. But actually the impact is also being in terms of resilience and in terms of the climate space as well. So there's a lot that's been done. There's a lot we can still learn, and there's a lot of very good innovations out there that if we really search for them and collectively share them, can have a really massive impact. And that's what we need to do, is on all the arable land of this world and all the natural grasslands of this world and all the forested areas of this world, if we all collectively have impact, we can really start to turn the curve. And as good stewards, that's what we should be doing. And as good stewards of God's creation, that's what we should be doing.
Thank you, Brendan.
Anna, maybe if I could add something.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe this is to encourage also automation of data collection process, also in the mill process, and basically this is because it is critical we account for every single data that we're able to collect for our resilience projects. And mainly because when referring to resilience, then our intervention success may not necessarily, come out clearly in terms of improvement, but rather in terms of, the overall situation being less bad that it could have been without the intervention. So this is only, or rather it is made possible by then, having an analysis of trends in data. So then we are able to have a clear picture of our intervention on the ground. So I highly encourage then that we, use tools that I think you've mentioned earlier, geoprocessing tools, as well as online data collection so that we're able to maximize on the data that we're able to capture during our programming and evaluation.
Thank you, Kelvin. Any further questions? If there is no questions, perhaps I have a question to you. We have this policy now, and it's still going through the PDAC because we had some rounds of discussion here and there. It's going to go through IMAC as well. We're going to get it approved. But what as a network do you feel we should cover more in the webinars? Maybe some parts of this webinar come short, maybe some practical solutions you are still missing. So what suggestion would you give to us in terms of what could we share with the network in the webinar, maybe in another session, some particular topics? It's a very silent group. Okay, guys, if you don't have any suggestions or cannot think about anything now, maybe you can think about something later. Maybe you could write an email or yeah, and let us know. Anna, you could maybe say it. What you will say? What you're writing, Anna? Informal question. Anna Albuquerque wrote that there was a presentation on the office footprint. Yes. And as a matter of fact, we are working on a manual, which is a little bit longer, and we hope to release it quite soon in the next couple of months, which will be working on the reducing emission in other offices and reducing emission in our projects with a practical solution of what could be done, how to calculate emissions, and so on and so forth. Document will be a little bit longer, and we are going to have a separate webinar on this as well. Okay, guys, if there is no more questions, thank you so much for your participation, and I hope you could take something what was of interest to you out of it, and we hope we can make our projects and mostly communities that we work with more resilient. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Oh.
Bye, Anna.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.